Number 3, we're going to be graphing a parabola in standard form, and all we have to do is plot 3 points. So the 3 points we're going to plot will be the vertex, the y-intercept, and the reflected point using the y-intercept. So for part A, deciding whether it goes up or down, I look at the original equation and I look at the very first term. If you have positive x squared, it's going up, and if you have negative x squared, it's going to be going down. So my U shape will have arrows pointing down. For part B, the axis of symmetry, the line that cuts it into two reflected halves. The formula to find the axis of symmetry is opposite of b over 2a. So if I look at my original equation, a is the number in front of the x squared, so in this case it's negative 1, and then b is the number in front of the x, so that would be negative 2. So if I look at my formula, the opposite of b, if b is negative 2, the opposite's positive 2, and that's over 2 times a, and a would be negative 1. So if I simplify this, I would have 2 divided by negative 2, which is negative 1. So my axis of symmetry, the line that cuts it in half, would be at x equals negative 1, so I'm going to draw that dashed line here at x equals negative 1. The axis of symmetry is always your x-coordinate of your vertex. So we're halfway done with part C. The x-coordinate is negative 1. How do I find the y-coordinate? I take negative 1 and plug it into this equation here for x. So the original equation, I would suggest actually rewriting the first term as negative 1x squared, writing in that coefficient of negative 1. So negative 1x squared minus 2x plus 3 is the original. So that when I plug in negative 1 for x, which right now I'm just saying f of negative 1 means I'm plugging in negative 1 for x. You don't forget that negative 1 coefficient in front. So if I plug in negative 1, I would have negative 1, I would open up parentheses, and I would plug in negative 1, and then I would square that. Minus 2, open up parentheses, and plug in negative 1. And then my back term here is plus 3. So my first term here, if I look at order of operations, I know I have to square negative 1 first and then multiply it by negative 1. So if I take negative 1 and square it, I would have positive 1, but if I multiply it by the negative 1 coefficient in front, that would give me negative 1. My middle number here should be twice as big an opposite sign, and that works out because if you multiply negative 2 and negative 1, you get positive 2. And then the third term is just plus 3. So negative 1 plus 2 is 1, and 1 plus 3 would give me a value of 4. So my vertex is negative 1 comma 4. In fact, that's the very first point I'm going to plot on this graph here. So starting at the origin, I go 1 to the left and up 4. That would be right here. So that's my first point. The y-intercept is really easy. If you look at the original equation, your y-intercept is always 0, c, and c is that third number in the list. So c is 3. So that means my y-intercept is 3. So 0, 3. So that is the second point I'm going to plot. So looking at the origin here, I'm just going to be going up 3 and plotting that point there. So that takes care of the y-intercept, and then my last point that I'm going to plot, I'm just going to reflect it. So if I look at the y-intercept here that I plotted at 0, 3, I notice it's 1 unit to the right of the axis of symmetry, the line that cuts it in half, the dashed line. So I'm just going to go 1 unit to the left in relation to the axis of symmetry, so right there. So connecting my U shape going down. So for domain, domain is your x values. Two ways you could think of it. If you look at it visually, you're asking yourself how far left does it open and how far right along the x-axis. Since it slowly opens up forever to the left and to the right, it would hit all negatives and all positives. So your value for every parabola that's not in a scenario where it's cut off is negative infinity to positive infinity. Another way you could think of it is what x values are you allowed to plug in for x. If you made a t-chart, you could pick any negative number and any positive. So it's negative infinity to positive infinity. The range is your y values. So you're looking at the lowest y value. Notice that it's pointing down, so that means it's going to continue to point down and hit all of the y values below, and since it goes on forever, the lowest would be negative infinity. And then if you travel up the y-axis, as I'm traveling up, I notice that it ends right here. So that value happens to be the y-coordinate of the vertex, which is 4. And that gets a bracket. The infinity symbol does not get a bracket because it's not an actual number. It's more of a concept. And 4 is included in the graph. So again, notice that the highest point happened to be the same as the y-coordinate of the vertex.